I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you got to worry about.
Welcome back to Profiler Africa, folks. My name is Paul Llewellyn, and this week we are bringing an old favorite back to the opening, which we'll do every week once again from now on, backed by popular demand. In a country where 75 people are murdered every day, we go beyond headlines, beyond motives, and straight into the minds of those who commit the most terrible crimes. Tonight we are joined by Brin Hodgskiss, a South African-born behavioral analyst with decades of experience in UK policing, counter-terrorism, and offender profiling. He's the co-author of Killer Stories, a brilliant book that doesn't just look at what killers do, but how they justify it to themselves. We're talking about the stories offenders tell, how they evolve, and what those narratives reveal about guilt, denial, and dangerous minds. And we may drop in a little bit about being a stand-up comedy maverick in the 90s. As always, I'm joined by South Africa's leading forensic psychologist, Gerard, who headed the forensic psychology at SAPS for 15 years. Let's say hello to Gerard. Good evening, Gerard.
Hey, everybody.
And before we get started, Gerard, we need to address something very important that the viewers have brought to our attention. And that is that apparently Gerard is the most gorgeous man in crime, is Gerard. So thanks, guys.
Paul.
What we're
I know
doing...
some people say Ted Bundy is more of a handsome man than me, but that's fine.
Well, I thought it was this Luigi Mangione guy, but it seems like you've pipped him to the post, Gerard. Yeah, so wait, before we say hi to Brin, then let's not say, but let me have a chat with Gerard. There you are. Yeah, so, sorry. Okay, I'm just going to bring us all up and we'll say hi to Brin. Hi, Brin. There's Brin Hodgskiss. Welcome to the show, Brin.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's lovely to have you here with us. Tonight, we are going to be basically profiling the profilers. We're so lucky, and we get to take a look at kind of compare and share war stories, essentially, on your roles working in very kind of similar spheres in the UK, Brin, and, of course, in South Africa, Gerard. So maybe a good place to start is, comparing sizes, guys. Who had it worse for 15 years of policing?
You know what? I would concede that crown to Gerard. I think, the level of stuff Gerard has dealt with in terms of sort of volume of crime and just all round hecticness. I'm afraid I can't beat that. So, round one to Gerard, certainly in size comparison.
Well, there you go. He's the most gorgeous man in crime, and yeah, that was a so. Brin, lovely for you to join us. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a conversation with us. Like I say, tonight we're really going to be kind of drawing a line between what you both did for 15 years in policing, working in your respective parts of the world. Brin obviously has a background here in South Africa as well that we'll talk a little bit about. And then also we'll talk about your careers post that and do some comparisons and talk about that as well. But to start off with, Brin, I mean, let's get to know you a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your background. Tell us what it is that you do now, and give us a little breakdown of your career trajectory so that everyone watching has a clear sense of who exactly it is that
who they're faced with.
Exactly, who they're faced with tonight.
So, I mean, my career started, where we both went to university, Paul, at Rhodes University, and it started literally over the body of a dead schoolgirl. So I was part of an academic unit at Rhodes that was helping the South African police, at that time Mickey Pistorius's unit, profile serial offenders. And we were trying to pull together an offender profile of a schoolgirl who had just been murdered. And it was and she had had her throat cut ear to ear, and it was standing over that body that I got this most amazing rush of motivation because I thought, this is something I can do something about. I can stop this sort of stuff happening again and again. So then when the opportunity came up to go and interview serial murderers, because Mickey was wanting to build up the South African knowledge of serial murderers, I jumped at the chance. And that wave of motivation carried me through those interviews. And then when I went for a gap year in the UK, I ended up joining UK policing, and for 15 years working my way through UK policing, mainly criminal intelligence and intelligence analysis, doing murders, robberies, all the way up to like serial rape. But I still think Gerard wins the full-on intensity prize. There's a couple of anecdotes there. So
yeah. Look, going back to university days, I mean, and funnily enough, like I was saying when we were chatting before the show, I think it was definitely your house. There was a book in your house, in your bathroom, in your digs at varsity. I remember being stuck in your bathroom for about 45 minutes looking at some of the most horrendous images I'd ever seen in my life, kind of Jeffrey Dahmer corpses and what have you. Yeah, and it was also you, Brin, that at the time I'd wanted to do a fourth-year documentary project on serial killers, and Stuart Vilken was in our part of the world at that time, and Brin was very kind to try to help me to get that off the ground. We couldn't get it through correctional services, but me and Brin go way back to university days. But of course, you and Gerard there's a lot of overlap there too. So you guys have known each other a long time. So let's talk a little bit about and understand how you guys know each other and how you met and got to know each other, and where your paths have crossed over the years as well.
Well, from my memory, and Gerard, correct me if I'm wrong, we met in prison.
Could be. I was trying to think about that myself when we first met, and I'm not sure. So it could be, yeah.
Well, I think it was, we were interviewing the same guy at round about the same time. We happened to cross paths, and I think you mentioned, I've heard about this investigative psychology thing. Do you happen to have Mickey's phone number? And I think that was my tiny part in the career trajectory of Gerard. And then years later, when I was in the UK, and I thought, you know what? I probably should try do this doctorate thing because, I've got some tapes of serial murderers. I maybe should do something. I then reached out to Gerard to say, can you be my supervisor and beat me into shape? And then he proceeded to do that for the next 4.5 years. But I don't know what you recall, Gerard.
Yeah, look, I mean, I definitely recall that we connected again. It was 2002 at a sort of a profiling conference in Paris.
Yes. Yeah.
I definitely remember that time. But your time though at Rhodes initially, because you were part of the MTM Crime Prevention Center, which was started up to sort of assist the police with crime research, and that's where you did your initial serial murder interviews, wasn't it?
Yes. So we started doing sort of interviews on serial rapists, and then I picked up an opportunistic interview with a serial murderer or two who I could justify with. But that's where the journey started. Yeah.
When we were heading off to music festivals, I think Brin was running around the country interviewing killers and rapists in prison. Then is that what we're saying?
Yeah, probably. I got my kicks in a whole different way. That's probably a different a different angle. But I do remember at that Paris conference, and I bring it up because it's a good indication of sometimes the level of things you get used to in South Africa. Is that because I remember that I was never too disturbed by gory stuff, which was lucky because you saw quite a bit of it quite quickly. But academically in Europe, you could study this stuff for years without ever coming across something that is stomach turning. And I remember, Gerard, in Paris, you were giving a presentation on, I think, a Muti murder. I remember some poor audience member keeling over and sort of falling sideways out the desk at some of the slides you had shown up. And I was like, okay, so yeah, things are different between studying in Europe and studying in South Africa.
I mean, I was part of a group of people doing research on case linkage, in serial murder offenders, and this was a collection of people like other profile. Months in whatever from the part of Europe, Netherlands, Belgium, research the new cases, and so I presented one of our serials, and afterwards, one of the Belgian profilers came up and said it was so shocking and inappropriate that I was showing crime scene photographs, and she was so traumatized. I remember looking at it and think, but you're a profiler for the Belgian police. What are you telling me that you should have been warned? And this is a small group of like 10 people. It's not like a conference of 100 and you don't know who's there. And just for them, it was just overwhelmingly shocking. I'm like, but this is your job. I mean, how can you be overwhelmed and shocked? And it wasn't anything particularly excessively gruesome, that was just a normal murder series. It was, so just what you're exposed to and what you experience is not, it's, even when we spoke to Lena Hakkinen the other day, she said murders in Finland is, drunk guy, gets drunk in a bar, kills another guy, hangs around waiting for the police to pitch up, and nothing really outside of that. So I mean, that's nice. I mean, I kind of wish I was living in one of those countries, but for people working in the field, I think just it must be boring.
Yeah.
I am getting some notes from viewers here that we might be having a couple of little technical bit of freezing going on, a little bit of internet trouble, but hopefully that will pass us by. It does rear its head every now and again. I did just want to say to everybody, if you're tuned in, please do hit the like and subscribe button if you're enjoying the conversation here. And you're welcome to become a member as well. Please do just hit the join button if you'd like to become a member and support the channel. And please do jump on the conversation and pose any questions for Brin and Gerard, and any comments you might have as we go as well. Brin, tell us let's talk a little bit about how it was then you got into policing in the UK. How did that come about, and what was your initial trajectory there?
So, joining policing in the UK was just like, I'd actually really enjoyed my time working with the South African police. So I thought, you know what, let's see what it's like in the UK. So I joined, the UK consists of, they don't have a national police force. They've got 42 sort of county forces. And I joined one of those county forces as an intelligence analyst. And the way I described my job for most of that 15 years is, if you picture like the Hollywood picture of a murder room, where up at the front of the room, you've got a whiteboard and you've got a heroic detective standing in front of the whiteboard, and there's all the faces linked together with a network chart. My team would be the people putting up the network chart. And I would probably be one of the people sitting in the banks of computers behind the hero that occasionally shouts up, we found where he lives and we've been tracking his movements. So that was really a lot of my job. And I guess one of the things that's striking, and we'll discuss this more, was the difference in the level of resourcing in that you'd find in the UK policing context versus South Africa. So, what I felt was certainly, the depth of experience of individual investigators in South Africa was remarkable. And what they managed to achieve with the tools they had was remarkable. And I do think there's something that UK policing can learn from how investigations can be run in a low-tech environment, around how you sort of can detect crime series without having computers to help you do it. Because we can come on to some comparisons about how you do case linkage in the SA legal context versus the UK one. Okay.
Gerard, I mean, for you, what has been your exposure to policing in the UK, on a practical level?
So I mean, some people might be too young to remember, but in 2001, I think it was the week after the the 9/11 planes flying into the air to those buildings in New York, the body of a torso of a young boy was found floating in the Thames River. Boy of African descent, no head, no arms, no legs. And that kind of led that investigation, which was being conducted by the Catford Serious Crime Group. The lead investigator, Will O'Reilly, and his senior came out to South Africa to get some advice, information, appeal by Nelson Mandela for assistance, because they could identify it through various testing, from genetics to isotopes in the teeth, that the young boy had come from Nigeria and not too long before his death. So part of it was coming out to South Africa for Mandela to have a appeal to Africa to come forward with information to identify this little boy. And it was just quite amazing. And then I went over there after that to meet with them in the UK. And, they had, for example, we still till today work with paper files for a case docket. And back then, they had electronic systems, simple things like that. That Catford Serious Crime Group had, I think, 21 investigators, and they would and that whole unit for a year would maybe deal with 12. So, that whole group of 21 seriously experienced trained detectives would work on it. And then they would have a whole bunch of other resources. They could task like 20, 30 uniformed people to go knock on doors and take statements for them. They would have 50 people doing a fingertip search through the grass in an area to try and find the most minuscule piece of evidence. So I think it was just the technology, the resources. I mean, they spent millions of pounds doing all these various analyses, from the pollen inside the kids' lungs to, as I said, the isotopes in their teeth, and just pumped so much money into that particular case. It was just, I mean, I started to think how we would solve stuff if we had that level of human resources and tech resources. Where now our solving rate is I think it's below 10% on our murders in South Africa, where I think England is probably, I don't know if Brin, you would know the stats on England's solving rates.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? I should have come with that stat, armed with that stat at my fingertips. I don't, but it would be far higher. I mean, it struck me when I was working with detectives in Makanda, asking them, how many murders do you have on your docket? And they'd be like, about 12. And then when I was going through my sort of basic analysis training, we get sent away to Manchester to be trained. It was, just 12 people was just the core admin team to run the home system, the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, which records all the details of the crime. That was just that number. And just as Gerard said, you would get 200 officers working on a murder, and an open and shut murder in the UK, guy gets into a fight in the bar, stabs someone in the neck, everyone knows who it is, he's arrested straight away. That costs the UK taxpayer about £1 million. Open and shut case. So with that level of resourcing, you can understand why more cases are solved, because you can just put more money into it. And I say that not to make your South African listeners despair. I say that to help your South African listeners sort of understand that actually, no matter how motivated and committed South African police officers are, and I'm sure they are, there's sometimes things you just can't do because there's not enough of you with the right equipment.
There's obviously, become I would imagine you'd call it a despondency amongst a lot of police. And, we do talk about here in South Africa there being quite a brain drain out of the police, with the likes of Gerard, who's, had a good lengthy career period at the police, but in retirement is not called upon to kind of, for there to be a continuity of the intelligence that Gerard brings, for example. A couple of questions. Are you seeing some of the professional cops, some of that expertise landing up on your side of the pond? And what is your perspective on crime in South Africa from there these days, having had, some experience in both parts of the world?
Well, you know what? I can't say necessarily whether we're seeing lots of South African expertise in crime and intelligence come over to England. I think sometimes I found the British police forces are are in some ways can be quite closed because it's mostly career officers. The pensions are very good. So after your time spent in the police, you retire, and it would be you replace yourself with people similar to yourselves. They don't have the same direct entry scheme, for example, that sort of Gerard took advantage of when Gerard joined, where you join at a certain rank. They've tried, but that hasn't really been successful. In terms of crime, one of the things that strikes me is that in the UK, well, people are always afraid of crime, and the stories they tell themselves around crime can mean that your perception of crime and your perception of being at risk of crime becomes hugely inflated. I mean, I always felt as a white guy, having worked at the South African police a bit, it made me realize that so much of the horrifying crime that was reported about South Africa happened to poor people and happened to people in the townships. It didn't happen as much to people like me. But coming over to the UK, I see similar patterns in how people talk about crime, and what they're afraid of about crime is that what they're afraid of doesn't always mirror reality.
Okay. Okay.
Paul,
And then,
Paul, you asked the
sorry,
question about
yeah.
South African cops going overseas. In my experience, I've seen more South African cops go to Australia. There was a big drive about 10 years ago to get South African cops to go to Australia, specifically the more sort of rural areas, and also New Zealand. So I know a lot of our forensic guys went to New Zealand, straightforward normal cop went to Australia. A sprinkling of forensic experts would go over to the US to work in some of their laboratories. But yeah, I can't say that I really have heard of South African cops.
Okay. Okay.
I think that would partly reflect, I think, where the parts of the world that are generally more attractive to South Africans, because they've got more sun, but also places like Australia, and I know from now I work in the National Health Service, they will also poach English doctors.
Okay.
Because they're like, or South African doctors, because they want to make sure they get the skills. And so I think it's maybe an Australian thing more than a policing thing.
Yeah. Or flying up and down the country, protecting the mines of Africa. That also, we seem to have a bunch of that going on as well. Flying up and down the continent. Okay, so I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you, Una, who has just become a member. We appreciate you. If you would like to become a member on the channel, it's just a small monthly fee. And of course, you're contributing to the growth of independent media. And like I always say, it feels a little bit better than paying your TV license up. We like to think anyway. Okay, let's talk a little bit about your book at this stage. Let's jump in there, because I'm sure it'll become, the kind of themes and topics of the book will become relevant to some of the conversations as we kind of dip back into talking about your career and what have you. There we go. That's a get it up. So, tell us a little bit about the book. How did it come about? Of course, you worked on it with one of our favorites, together with Nicole Engelbrecht of True Crime South Africa. So just tell us a little bit about the book and the trajectory of the book.
Yeah, so you know what, and maybe in some ways similar to Gerard, when I sort of came out of policing, I was a little bit, gutful, and I just thought, you know what, let me just try something different for a while. But what I realized is that the seed that had been planted when I was interviewing the serial murderers kind of kept growing, because what had really struck me as I'd gone from maximum security prison to maximum security prison in my second-hand Volkswagen Jetta was the role that the serial murderers' stories they told themselves about themselves affected the crimes they then committed. So, their stories actually were a very powerful engine for the offending. And that idea had sort of stuck with me, and I'd started to explore it in the PhD. And it was only just before COVID where Nicole tapped me up on Twitter, said, "Do you want to do a podcast?" And I did that. And I sort of felt like I had an itch that needed scratching or a grudge that I needed to take care of with all those interviews I had done. So I went back and was working through them, and that's where sort of Killer Stories came from, is trying to draw out what are the stories that created offending, and then what can we learn about those stories for ourselves, living our everyday lives? How can we take those lessons from those dark edges of humanity and use them to make our lives better?
And in the book, do you talk about specific cases? Do you unpack how do you relay how do you relay the message?
Yeah. So one of the things I had to do was I had to anonymize the cases, because when I originally did the interviews, the ethics committee was requiring that I protected the anonymity of the men I spoke to. And, and then on the consent form, it had said, if you reuse this material, I might reuse it, but I will continue to protect your anonymity, which I've done. Because it's the ethical rules that governs how we should be working as psychologists. The added benefit, actually, the added unexpected benefit of when you tell somebody's story and it's their media image has been stripped away, the personality of the person often comes forward in a different way, because you sort of see that character without the trappings that the media may have given them before they went into prison. So we explore sort of 7 killer stories in total, and followed roughly the same structure for the first half of the book. Is Nicole did the true crime elements, so told the story about their crimes, and then I take the reader sort of through the prison gates into the prison, sitting opposite a guy and having a conversation about what they did and their story they tell themselves around it.
How did that, let's talk a little bit about that. How did that start for you? What was it like? I mean, do you recall your first interview with somebody who was, genuinely an interesting character? And, let's just start at the beginning, let's just start there, I think.
Yeah, so, I mean, I had spoken to some rapists before, and there are some genuinely interesting characters in those. But I definitely remember the first serial murderer I spoke to, and in the book we call him Michael. And your readers, when I hope, and your viewers, when they pick up the book, I'm sure they can work out most of the people we speak to, and no prizes for guessing. But, Michael I sat down opposite him and he was just like, so do you want to know why I did it? Almost straight away. And I remember sort of chatting to him, and his crimes were quite extreme. And I remember sort of being quite mesmerized by his hands, because he strangled these victims. And I was expecting like big, rough strangler's hands. When he shook his hands, I was expecting that rough farmer hand. But no, they were sort of delicate and soft and small, almost feminine. And that experience of seeing somebody who actually looked pretty normal, I could be sitting opposite this guy in a pub having a beer, and then he's just talking about how he introduced himself almost like a fairy tale monster. If you abuse your kids, I will come take them away. And then I'll hear you crying, your child is gone. And you're sort of sitting there nodding along, and then it was only afterwards you realize, wow, it's like this trap door's opened into the sort of claustrophobic underworld.
Yeah.
That parallel universe that runs alongside our everyday lives. And that was quite memorable.
Was it a journey for you to get past the kind of the perception of it, or the media identity of it? I'm sure that you will have done, whenever you speak to someone, you've researched them before, you're aware of what their profile is in the media. How long what was the arc of you kind of stripping that stuff away and being able to just get to the person?
So, before every interview, it was like a mini investigation. So I would have ideally gone to the investigative psychology unit in Pretoria, got any information that they'd hold on the person, got some information also from media, or ideally also speak to the investigating officer. So by the time I sat down opposite, the people I call Michael or Jacques or Kyle, I would have a pretty good idea of what they had done. So then my job in the interview was to listen and to ask questions. And I'd love to hear Gerard's view, because, people have asked me quite a few times over the years, weren't you scared? And I was like, no, not at all. I just wanted to do a good job interviewing. And a lot of your training as a psychologist is, how do you keep that clinical distance from what the person is describing and what your own feelings might be? And I'm lucky, and maybe I've got that same streak in my character that Gerard has, was keeping that clinical distance I found quite easy.
Gerard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because, I mean, how you, like you say, your mind builds up, and I've said this many times on this show and the podcast, your mind builds up the image of the person, because what you know of him is basically from the crimes and the crime scene in the docket. We often don't know anything about these guys because the cops don't gather that. They're not really interested in that kind of information. So it's not appearing in a case file. We don't get these deep psychological analysis that people expect probably people to be doing. So you get there and you just have the violence. And I always say that, that they have killed 7 people. That might be 7 hours of their whole life. That's not even a work day if you condense it. So the rest of the days of their lives, they're doing everything that we all have to do, trying to survive, work, family, getting sick, getting happy, getting angry, getting drunk. So there's a lot more commonality that we have with these people. So like I agree with the first time I went to see one of my serials, I think it was probably to ask them to participate in my master's research, was probably someone like John Frank Brown, who him and his partner killed a bunch of guys in the 90s. And being like seriously just anxiety, a lot of anxiety, not fearing for my life, but just feeling like I'm out of my depth and really anxious. But like once you've gone through that first one, you just realize, okay, these are really just people, and you can't, if you're going to see them 20 sessions, it's impossible for them to talk about their crimes for 20 sessions because it runs out. So they're going to be talking about other stuff. And it becomes that daily chat. Well, I mean, I was seeing some of these guys for like 2 or 3 years. So it became like, hey, what's been happening since I last saw you? What's going on in the prison? How's your job going? Have you had not an email? Have you had a letter from your family and stuff like that? And that was interesting for me, almost just to see that. I mean, because I knew what the crimes were about. I'd seen the dockets. So it was really, I was more interested in just interacting with them and just seeing their view of the world and stuff like that. Yeah.
Do you guys find, again, I mean, I think we're getting into it now, because profiling the profilers, feels like the path to go down here. But how did you feel? Did you find that, initially when you were starting off doing interviews, for example, Brin, you would have gotten a bunch of information on this person and you would have maybe garnered some things from it. As you guys have kind of evolved and grown and been interacted with more and more of these types of people and the crimes that they commit, are you able to look at the actions and walk in kind of better equipped into a conversation about kind of what some of the things that make this person tick?
I mean, Gerard might have had more experience than I of doing that with more people for longer. One of the big learning points for me was, and if I could go back and give advice to 24-year-old Brin, because I was listening to the tapes and going, oh, dude, when I was hearing any mistakes I made, was to go in and just be able to listen without judgment. Because one of the things I remember asking Gerard was a lot of the book we had in our toilet at Rhodes would go into, like, if there's a serial murderer, he's got to have this intense fantasy which drives a lot of their stuff, and you need to get them to disclose their fantasy to you. And actually, that wasn't what I was finding. I found a lot of the guys had a good reason for doing it, but it sort of threw me off that it actually was on the surface. It was in their story. In the story they were telling me was all the reasons they needed to do the crime they did. They didn't need some hidden Freudian abuse that was long repressed, in order to give a perfectly reasonable explanation, or reasonable to their mind, why, yeah, I killed that person, those people.
I mean, that sounds similar to somebody who's, in a cult. With is that a fair comparison? Are there not also, physiological issues that weigh in there as well, potentially? Or, what's the comparison there?
Well, it could be, and I'll bring it back to a point that Gerard just made, was that, people might be committing murder for 7 hours of their life. For the rest of the time, they're perfectly normal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me when I was doing the research was like, there's at the core, there's our personality. And that's pretty much stable in our adulthood. And then wrapped around our personality are how we adapt to our life. So, Gerard and I might have the identical personality, but because we've been exposed to different things, we evolve different adaptations. And then wrapped around all of that is the story. And that's more dynamic. That's how we're making sense of things. And for somebody to become a murderer, it's almost like the combination of a bicycle lock all need to line up. So your characteristic adaptations, your personality, the story you're telling, and then just circumstance, a little bit of bad luck, where, you met the wrong person at the wrong time. And suddenly that evil mindset or that evil set of circumstances are upon you and you commit your crime.
Okay.
So yeah.
Gerard, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I must say, you often, maybe it's just the TV image that these offenders have these really deep, rich fantasies that are coming from the long histories in their lives of things that happened to them. And I just didn't find that with South African serials. So either South African serials were just different, or that was just more of a Hollywood myth or an early FBI profiling myth, maybe just because of the case they just happened to have. Was like the Welkom case, where we really saw this long, deep fantasies that they each had for what they wanted to do with the victim, and thought about it and wrote about it and drew pictures about it and started to slowly act it out. But that was like the anomaly in South Africa. It wasn't the norm, that's for sure.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to a couple of questions quickly because we have some lining up here on the chat. Let's go to Maxine's question first. Maxine Isherwood, did you ever feel scared or intimidated by any of the serials you interviewed? I mean, has anyone ever tried to, meaningfully intimidate either of you?
I don't know about you, Jared. I would never say anyone meaningfully intimidated.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the first guys I spoke to, I remember going in with that image of these crime scenes at the docket, and he'd beaten his victims so badly that one of his victims had choked to death on the bones of her own face.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was going in there expecting this mountain of a human. And he wasn't so big. And then he came in all bound up in his handcuffs. They sort of then chained him to the chair. And this was unusual. It wouldn't normally happen, but it was the prison he was in. That was standard protocol. And as soon as his hands came free, he kind of reached across the table. And I flinched back until I realized actually he just wanted to shake my hand. And then I was like, the little voice in my head was like, okay, that wasn't cool, Brin, pull it round. Shook his hand, and he just spoke for 7 hours straight. Because what I think they saw in me, and probably saw in Gerard, was just somebody who's going to listen to them.
Yeah.
And so that was much more of a motivation. I wanted to tell their story and have somebody listen without judgment. And there's no benefit for them to scare or intimidate.
On this topic of, unpacking this idea of them telling their story. So there's the story, and you often hear kind of that somebody with this type of personality does like to talk, a lot of the time will like to talk about the things that they've done and et cetera, but then also retain information. that, to retain that sense of control, is it, over the, whatever the control they can still keep their hands on. Do you notice that in discussions where there's that conflict between, I want to tell you, but also, I don't want to, I don't know.
I found there was one serial particularly that eventually didn't end up in the book, but let's call him Katleo. And Katleo, he came across like he reminded me of like a young Denzel Washington. He was intelligent, he was well spoken, could pass for a businessman, very confident, and he would say, like, these psychologists, they make all these theories about why people do these things, but they've got no real experience. You need someone who's got real experience to really tell you about what happened. And I started to realize, like, actually that was his pattern. He would offer, the temptation of this wonderful nugget of information that nobody else have, and then would pull it back. I mean, frankly, really quickly, you just find it annoying because it's not, at least I did. It's not, it's not particularly subtle. And it's not particularly interesting because very quickly you sort of go, well, there's nothing I can discover here from somebody who is trying to control things so tightly. I'm seeing Gerard smiling, so I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, look, I was just thinking about this now as Brin was speaking, and I think there's probably 3 in my career. Most, the interviews went really well. Fairly 3 that stand out that just like either just irritated the hell out of me, or I was a bit nervous about. The one that I was nervous about, purely because he was massive, was the Pandile Nchungwana, the Brighton Beach axe murderer, because he was an ex-Blue Bulls rugby player. So he was just like a huge lad. I mean, he was huge. So I just kind of thought, if he decided to get pissed off with us, and he was very like hesitant to acknowledge, like even when we asked him, like, what shoe size do you have? I'm not going to answer that question. So he would just randomly say he's not going to answer certain questions. And that just started to piss me off because it felt like he was playing a bit of a game. The second one who also irritated the hell out of me was the sugarcane killer, Tozamila Taki from was it Mzinto? Because also, I mean, he'd been solidly linked to all his crimes. Had this interview with him. Then he started to play this game where we said, well, can you tell us about this? Well, which crimes are you talking about? What do you know about them? And I'm like, well, I don't know. What crimes are you referring to? And and I just picked up he was just trying to mess us around. So that was just like really irritating. And then the next one, who wasn't irritating, but I knew he was just trying to massage his image, was of course Thabo Bester, when I interviewed him in 2011 after he was initially arrested for the 2 rapes and the murder, long before he became the Thabo Bester that everybody knows now. And I mean, he is just such a manipulating liar that, anything he says you just can't believe. And I remember at the end of the interview, I said to him, is there anything else that you'd like to tell me? And it was a long interview. And he said, well, I don't know. I mean, why don't you tell me how I've done, and then I'll maybe decide whether I need to say anything else to you. So clearly, like, this whole impression management kind of stuff. And it's like that. But those are the 3 that stand out. But I've never had really, one that was freaked me out or as this really, really made me scared. As I said, Nchungwana was just because he was massive, and if he did decide to go, rogue, there was not much we could do about it. But yeah.
Okay.
You know what? And actually, one of a guy that I do talk about in the book that slightly irritated was somebody we call Kyle. And every time I felt like he was about to reveal something meaningful about himself, like he said, well, I used to be violent, and then he'd change the topic, but now I found Jesus and I would never be violent again. And he did that over and over again. And eventually I just thought, he's lying to me. And you can hear at the end of the tape, I had a slightly lapse in professionalism, and I was like, Elvis has left the building just before I turned off the tape, because it felt like a performance. But it was only going back to the tape that I realized, actually, I maybe got him wrong, is that the person he was trying to fool wasn't me, it was himself. Because if you can't tell a coherent story about what you've done, you never have to come to terms with the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are. Mm-hmm. So he could explain away all these crimes, and I think he was foggying his own story, so he didn't have to come to terms with what he had done. And funny enough, of all the people I spoke to, I wouldn't say he's the most dangerous, but I would most worry about him coming in front of a parole board, because he could very convincingly, because he could truly believe, I've never done anything wrong. I've managed to persuade myself that, that I am, of course, pure as the driven snow. And I would worry that he would be able to talk his way through that.
Okay. I'm going to take another question here, guys, from Lauren. Have you ever felt compassion for a particular offender? I would imagine you have. I mean, guys, Brin?
Yeah, absolutely. I felt, probably the word is, you feel sympathy for a human in pain. So one of the guys I mentioned, like Michael, his crimes were horrendous. The guy I call Michael in the book. But through the interview, it's like, and quite contrast, because he was a sort of scary looking chap, dark hair, dark beard, dark brows, and a kind of glowering hunch. But beneath that, there was like the real demeanor of like a wounded child. And it was that sort of sense of him being a wounded person who had never really got over that. I think you couldn't help but feel some compassion for the abused child he had been. That's
absolutely
probably my experience.
Yeah. Gerard, same question to you.
I don't know if I've ever felt like during the interview a sense of compassion. I guess I'm always just skeptical of what I'm hearing at all, anything the truth. But I think there's one. I mean, I started interviewing him as part of my master's research. Then I went back and interviewed him as part of my doctoral research. So just between the research, I'd probably spent 3-4 years interviewing him, and then didn't have contact with him for a number of years. And then when I joined the police, I then had some contact with him again. And I mean, till today, he phones me very often on a Sunday from the prison and asks me how I'm doing, etc. And that was John Frank Brown, who was one of, I mentioned him earlier in this episode, him and his partner, Samuel Jacques Coetzee, they were a gay couple, and they were picking up men and killing them, and boys and killing them, etc. in the mid-90s. And I think with him, I've seen over the past, since 1997 or 6, change and sort of growth.
Okay, Gerard, we are losing.
So
Gerard,
I don't know if it's compassion.
Gerard, we are losing you a little bit. Gerard is joining us from Kimberley today, and clearly the big hole is messing with the internet. Do you just want to go back a thought or two there, Gerard?
Right. So I don't know how far you got. So I interviewed him for many years, and I've just seen a lot of consistent change and growth, which I think is quite interesting to notice. And it's easy to say something to someone when you see them once or twice, but if you're speaking to them every Sunday when they phones you, and it's just interesting to see the change in him and insight that he's gained. Would I want him outside? Bit anxious, but I have it because I've seen the amount of work that he's trying to do, to bring change to his life. So that's been quite interesting. So I have.
We're definitely having trouble with the connection from Kimberley tonight. Okay. Yeah, Brin.
And actually, but I think Gerard's point's fascinating, because I wondered when I was doing the book, I was thinking to myself, would the guys say the same thing now, 20 years later? And actually, we end the book on like a redemption story of somebody who did commit a horrible crime and did the hard work to turn their life around. And I really, well, when we were doing the book, we're like, well, is what we're really saying? You'll tell a bad story about your life, and then your life will just go down a hole, and that's where you're doomed to be forever. Is that really the message we want to land? And it was when, Nicole had a conversation with Stefan Skutsia, who some people might know as a Worcester bomber, and we heard his story of how he did the hard yards to make amends for what was a really serious crime. And he rewrote his life story, and that wasn't that, when I was listening to it, every time I was like, no, dude, I think you've done enough. You're fine. I was like, he did more and more and more. And, nothing but admiration for somebody who's able to dig themselves out the hole.
Yeah.
And the reason partly we wanted to share it is when we spoke to Stefan, and neither Nicole or I had ever thought of this. He said, well, when you're in prison, you've got a lot of time to read. And we'll read crime stories, partly because we want to know, like, does anyone make it out of this?
Yeah.
And it never occurred to me that, you'd write a book about crime and it would be read in prisons.
Yeah.
And that would make me feel a little bit good about ending it on that story. And I'd love to have a longer conversation about John Frank Brown, because it's like that idea that you can redeem yourself and you can change your narrative and you can get better is something I think we can all take into our lives, and all the mistakes we make in just being humans who've been on the planet a while.
So sorry, Gerard.
Can I just say, because I just want to add on about Stefan Skutsia, because I also had the pleasure of meeting him, and I must say it was a pleasure. And he actually came to speak at a conference that we had, the African Association of Threat Assessment Professionals conference we had about 2 years ago. He came to speak about for those that don't know, he kind of got sucked up in at a very young age at sort of 1994, that change in the government, sucked up into sort of some right-wing stuff due to circumstances in his life, and then was part of, I think, 3 or 4 guys who planted some bombs in Worcester at a shopping mall, and some people died. Caught very quickly, sent off to prison, and how he went on that process of de-radicalization, but also the process of forgetting himself, but also then approaching all the victims and family members of victims and seeking their pardon, if you want to use that word, and how every one of those people eventually said, yes, we forgive you and we support your release. And he literally is the poster boy for restorative justice if you go onto their website. So Stefan he's got his own books that are out there. He's also, if you search him on YouTube, you'll find him. There's talks that he gives, and just how, I think I agree with you 100%. That's a guy who I definitely have compassion for because of how far he's changed and what he did to sort of prove that he's changed. So that's I 100% agree with you, Stefan.
Okay, Gerard, I don't know what you did to your internet there, but it worked. Well done. Okay, you just IT'd the heck out of it. Well done.
It was actually raining just now in Kimberley, and I think that's what made the internet go totally crazy for a few minutes.
There you go, rain. Okay, the weather still. Okay, so we're talking a bit about rehabilitation. The one thing I wanted to go down on this path is how much in your chosen professions as psychologists, gents, is there a future path to being able to get deep enough into the minds of people that rehabilitation becomes a plausibility for any and all offenders?
I don't think for any and all. I think for some.
Because
probably the day-to-day criminal. The day-to-day criminal
Sure.
is not committing his crimes due to some deep psychological motive. The ones that committed their crime because it is more financially based. They live in poverty. They haven't had education. Those are things you can fix. But I think that the type of guys that we worked with, they didn't have. Crimes weren't committed because of their circumstances. Really, it's just because of something just within them. We don't know why they developed to have that thing in them, and I don't know how do we undo it. So I do think that with proper rehabilitation, a lot of normal offenders can reintegrate back into society and live very normal lives. But the things that we kind of deal with, I'm not particularly think we'll ever reach a level of being able to say, we can fix those guys, and this is the pathway to do it. And we'll be certain that we should release them with comfortableness.
I would tend to agree, and I've because I also think once somebody's had sort of 30 years or longer to get to that point when they've committed such horrendous crimes. It's hard to undo all that damage. So if I were to say where we as a society should put our effort would be in intervening earlier and much, much earlier. It's like some of the most successful violence reductions initiatives in the United Kingdom have been dealing with kids about knife crime from the ages of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and teaching those boys, giving them better stories about what it means to be a man, giving them more opportunities. So a kid who might be a little bit angry, instead of learning that how he can get status is by fighting and carrying a blade, he learns about football. He learns about talking to people. He's supported by a network of adults who think he's worthy. So, I would definitely have a strong pitch for how we should be telling better stories about what it means, certainly to be a man and how a man should behave, would be, as a minimum, a wonderful place to start.
And talking about stories, I mean, on this subject, and you being in the UK, we've all been exposed to the recent series that was on Netflix, which seemed to cause quite a stir, that to the point that they were talking about it in Parliament, this series Adolescence, about this young boy committing an act of knife crime. And if you haven't seen it, it's just beautifully shot. I mean, I think each episode is shot in one single shot. So just that is something to behold. But is that show a fair reflection of some of the realities in the UK, where, just as an access point for our viewers to kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of debate and discussion around it. I mean, the level of violence in the UK, you can't compare. I do think, as the dad of a boy in his adolescence in the UK, I think the show's probably represented every parent's worst nightmare. The idea that your child, in the privacy of their own bedroom, gets radicalized by the internet, by the sort of the manosphere, that sort of the culture of toxic masculinity, and he comes out the other side wanting vengeance. And the first time you as a parent realize is when he's killed someone. I think the one reality I do think we need to deal with, and I think we need to deal it as men, and actually as a society, is that how certain narratives are seen to be acceptable. So if you think how many movies are out about revenge, and most of those movies are about violent revenge. Think about like Taken, John Wick. There's a male hero and something's been done wrong to him, like someone's killed his dog, and then they go on a murderous rampage. And that is solidly approved of in the storyline of the movie. And I think where we've got to be so careful, if you sort of, what you're encouraging in boys and men, is the idea that a man should be faced with an indignity, and the only proper way of dealing with it, the only manly way of dealing with it, is violence. Yeah. One of the guys I talk about in the book, Sisanda, I called him. He's a great example of somebody who, if he could get over his urge for revenge and realize that he doesn't need to take revenge on a girl because she's found another boyfriend. Especially not, he says himself, he said, I could have loads of girlfriends, but my girlfriends, they could only see me. And if they saw somebody else, then the only way I could make myself feel better was by getting my hands on them. And you just think, wow, if you told yourself a better story, how different your life would have been. Yeah. If you had those options, that it just would have made, well, it would mean a lot of people weren't murdered, but, even at a mundane level, even if he hadn't gone on to kill, his relationships would have been infinitely improved if he had lived from a better story, other than that one that I, as a man, need to take revenge on anyone I think who's hurt me.
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting time recently, the whole discussion around what masculinity looks like and what masculinity should be, and how do you retain some of the, maybe what people would consider to be kind of the instinctual aspects of masculinity, and some of those may have started to acquire a bit of a toxic kind of edge to them from a perception point of view, but aren't necessarily that. In South Africa, obviously, the perpetrators and victims of crime, the vast majority are young South African men. So yeah, it's certainly an interesting. It's the parallels. The fact that we're talking here about young men in the UK, and obviously, I think if you were to have a conversation about crime and where the major problem is, you would say that that's really where it lies in South Africa.
And what we and I'll shut up in a moment and let Gerard come in. But where we've got, so often when we have a debate about crime, we say, well, most women are killed by men, and most women are killed by their partners. Definitely in the UK. But it is also true that more men are murdered than women in total in the UK. It is also true in the UK that after car accidents, the leading cause of unnatural death for men under the age of 25 is suicide.
Yeah.
And what I think we need to get better at is being able to deal with it as a society, that all those stories are true and are equally true and valid. That men are inflicting enormous hurt on others, but also inflicting enormous hurt on each other and on themselves, because I think that gives us a path forward.
Yeah, you have to address them as the perpetrators and the victims, and maybe in recent mainstream media culture, there's been a little bit too much emphasis on the perpetrator side, and maybe we're starting to become a bit more empathetic to the other side. Gerard, thoughts there?
I don't know if I'm any good ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna come back to this question. Or let's jump back a little bit. It's going back a little bit, but it's certainly an interesting question. It's from Shelley Foot, and she said they may not be committing a crime all the time, a couple hours or whatever, as you say, but surely they would be at least thinking of the crime past or possible future crimes. I wanted to ask, we do bring up this idea that, most of the time these are normal people going about their daily lives, but every now and again they murder someone, and for that period they're a murderer. How much of the time how much of the fantasy, how much time is that fantasy living in their minds? How much of their thought life is taken up by that aspect of themselves?
Sure. I mean, that's a good one. I don't know. I don't think I've got a good answer for that one either, because we just didn't find a lot of ours had these very elaborate, deep sort of fantasies. But again, I would imagine you can't spend your whole day thinking about the same thing day in, day out for months. So I would imagine even where they did have relatively, clear fantasies, it wouldn't be something that they would spend the majority of their day thinking of. You might find as you get closer to them actually acting out the actual fantasy that it might become more preoccupying in their mind and thoughts. But, I don't think it's as a case of their brain suddenly defaults to thinking about it every moment that they're not distracted by something else.
Okay.
And I mean, I think just building on Gerard's thoughts is one of the advantages that the UK had was better infrastructure for reporting intelligence. So a lot of my job would have been combing through intelligence files, which are basically reports that somebody has made about somebody else who may or may not have been doing something dodgy. And that would give the police more opportunities to potentially intervene much earlier on somebody's offending pathway. So rather than, they've started to do harmful things to those around them, and we only found out about it when they've killed someone, what you might find in the UK is it comes from a teacher at school, raises a concern that the boy's been a boy or a girl has been engaging in some disturbing behaviors, and then the school would try and intervene. And then if the school can't intervene, social work would intervene. And if social work can't intervene, you'd start to get police reports. And then where we would have the advantage in the UK is if he had done something bad in a neighbouring police force, you could search on their intelligence databases to say, you know what, let's say for argument's sake, he's dismembered a cat and he's been dismembering the neighbouring cats. You could find out, are we getting lots of reports from neighbouring forces of cats being dismembered? And you sort of go, oh, heck, it's near his grandma's house. Right, we need to then ramp up our intervention in this person. So that is possibly maybe the reason why we didn't see as much fantasy in South Africa. Maybe was because it wasn't needed to fuel people through all those barriers between them and offending.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. The one thing I also wanted to ask when it came up a little bit earlier is just your experience of the prison system, and to illuminate for the listener the kind of difference between walking into a prison in South Africa to sit down and work with one of these offenders versus doing the same in the UK. Just kind of paint that picture for us a little as well, so we understand the context when you're sitting down speaking to these people a bit better.
Well, I'm going to be completely honest. I haven't been into a prison in the UK.
Oh, really?
I think I need to now put it on my to-do list because my work when I was in policing in the UK was very much facing into the police service. Okay. And yes, I'd gone to sort of post-mortems and crime scenes, but I hadn't gone through the prison gates in the other direction. You know what? But for your viewers, and Gerard, I don't know what your impression is my impression of a lot of prisons is just sort of mundane government, slightly run down facilities. You know what I mean? It's like if everyone can think back to those who are, as old as we are, think back to sort of some of your old primary schools with those polished floors and brick walls, and just add in more bars and the smell of sort of rolling tobacco and unwashed bodies, and you're not far off. I don't know what your impression is, Gerard.
Yeah, I can't quite. It's definitely in South Africa that I've been impressed by a prison. Although the private one in Bloemfontein when I went there in 2006 was not bad, but I think they'd just been built. The British in the UK, I'm not sure. Is Ashworth? Is that I think I went to Ashworth. Is that a prison or a secure psychiatric facility?
I wouldn't be sure.
Okay.
Probably secure psychiatric on some of the prisons, but.
Well, then, yeah, no, not in the UK prison then.
Okay. All right, moving along. Talking about the report, the access you have to information that I imagined is a lot more easily accessible. First of all, does information sit in multiple databases, or, for example, is there one central DNA database that you would look at, for example, in the course of an investigation? And what are the technologies that are emerging that are playing the biggest role in crime prevention in the UK? Where's the kind of emphasis? What's really working? I get the impression it's pretty hard to get away with a crime in the UK just because there's cameras pointing at you pretty much wherever you go.
I would say for example, like I worked on a serial rape case when I was in the major crime team in Hertfordshire. And, you checking the daily crimes and a report comes in about rape. And you're like, that is an unusual modus operandi. That is somebody experiencing that nightmare that every woman probably has of walking home from a night out and getting jumped on by somebody. And that was quite unusual. And then 2 weeks later, that happened again. And I remember driving to the major incident room with a female detective and her saying, I hope it's not wrong of me to say, but wouldn't it be amazing if this was a serial rapist? And then our force got notification that in neighbouring London, there was a series that they'd labelled by someone called the Southgate Rapist that had an extremely similar MO. And how they had noticed that is because in the UK, when there's murders, when there's rape committed by a stranger, you are required to automatically notify a central unit. They were called the Serious Crime Analysis Section. And their job will be to do some of that behavioural linkage, to be able to say, actually, the person who was in Southgate is highly likely the same person who's there now committed the rapes in St Albans in Hertfordshire. And then he had left DNA in Hertfordshire, and there is a central DNA database. And he was someone called Petros Anthea, who had committed rape previously. So fairly swiftly, you could bring the case together against him. Now, we could have taken a lot longer trying to do that without the technology. I mean, as far as I understood it, the solution Gerard had would be detectives in London thinking this sounds like a serial murder and phoning up detectives they'd been on a course with who might be working in the counties. So technology made that much quicker. I think you asked, what's the game changer? One of the things we did over and over again in the analysis was the power came from where you started to use the technologies alongside each other. So when you could track Petros Anthea's phone to be in the area of St. Albans, where you could then match the phone where the phone was with where his van was seen by CCTV. And then once you tracked his phone and his van, you could then say, okay, let's get statements from his girlfriend who lived in the area. And it was when you brought together all those technologies, that was the game changer. So it's all about linking them. That will really make the difference.
Something that comes up on the channel here is we talk about, and Gerard likes to bring up, for example, the example of Detective Boberg back in the 40s, the 20s to 50s in South Africa, who headed up the detectives and became the head detective in South Africa. But the essence of that is essentially those old tricks of the trade. That detective work, that solid old-fashioned, knocking on doors kind of thing. Is there a loss of that, and is that a problem? Are those muscles being less worked in the UK, and is that a problem?
I'd be fascinated at Gerard's views, because I do think there is a risk that, I was, I think sometimes in the UK police, they didn't know quite what to do with me because I was a little bit foreign. I was a little bit overeducated. And why was I working in intelligence? That was where the ladies worked. But I thought actually that was where I could add the most value. I could do much better work bringing those threads together than I could knocking on doors. But I do think there is a risk that there becomes an over-reliance on technology to do the job. There have been cold cases in the UK that have become cold cases because somebody didn't knock on the right door. They didn't do the basic nuts and bolts of a good investigation. So I do think you need to invest in the human factor. And there's a risk that if you rely on the analysts, the geeks like me, to do it in the back office, you're going to lose essential skills elsewhere.
Gerard, thoughts? Oh, Gerard, we've lost your audio there.
Sorry, and you need the detective to bring it all together and make sense of this information, because information on its own doesn't mean anything. DNA doesn't mean anything. You understand the context of the DNA, and then whose DNA is it? And cell phone printouts, you have to make sense of the cell phone printout. So you can have all the information there, but if you don't have a detective who knows what to do with it, you'll have nothing. So I do think, yes, if you rely, and I used to see it to some degree in South Africa, a detective would get a case and he would go, right, have I sent off a request for the cell phone information? Tick yes. Received it back, put it in the docket. Have I sent off this DNA to forensics? Yep, tick that off, great. And he basically just would do tick box investigation. And I've done this. Sometimes information comes back like cell phone information. But if you don't analyze the cell phone information, then it means absolutely nothing to you. So I don't think we'll ever get to the point where you don't have that good investigative thinker to make it all make sense and put a story together out of that information you have.
Yeah, you need the cop asking the right questions.
Well, and you're going to need to land something in court. One of the lessons I'd had when we were sort of testifying in a murder was sitting down with the barristers. The guys in the UK courts, they end up looking like magpies, the black robes and the wigs. But key part of his skill was, how do you tell a story from all the snowstorm of information that a jury can go, yeah, I got you. I can understand how you've joined up all these dots and why you've got the man in front of me you have. And I think that's going to be a skill that needs to remain.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the other thing is, I mean, there's no doubt that the application of more and more technologies is to the benefit of crime fighting, but at the same time, you're stripping away some of our kind of liberties, where some of our freedoms just to walk about in public without being looked at, you know, wherever you are.
It's kind of like nowadays with cars. You know, in the old days, like even 10, 15 years ago, mechanics knew how to fix a car because they knew what that knocking sound meant. Where nowadays, if you have a reasonably relatively fancy car, you go to the garage, they plug it into the computer, and the computer says what's wrong.
Yeah.
And if the computer doesn't tell them what's wrong, they don't know what to do. And you know, that can be a situation the same with policing. If you're just relying on the technology, and you don't have the ability to think. So, for example, I have a car. My mechanic's one of the old mechanics who's worked on how many editions of this particular brand of vehicle. And he'll actually find that the current mechanics at the dealership will phone him and say, we don't know what's wrong with this car. This and this and this is what's happening. And he'll go, oh, this is the nature of your problem. This is what you need to do. And that's, for me, that's the best comparison I can have, is that if your investigation becomes plug and play, then there's no more thinking involved. And the one question earlier was about AI. I mean, I do think AI can be helpful. I don't know how. I'm perhaps too old to figure it out in bringing information together, but I don't know if that can ever really replace the human thinker to put that together for court purposes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and I never thought the conversation would take this direction, but you know, I was at an analyst and police officers conference 2 weeks ago, and they were discussing AI analysis for handwriting. And one of the challenges is, like, it can do a very good job of analyzing handwriting, but they don't quite know. The problem is, how does the AI do the magic? And if you can't explain how it does the magic, you shouldn't be sending someone to prison because the magic might be wrong. And you know, we're seeing a very challenge in healthcare in the UK. It's like, yes, you can be diagnosed by Google, but what happens when Google gets it wrong?
Yeah. Look, we won't have to worry about this when we're all plugged into the matrix and powering the robot's batteries, which, you know, I'm no doubt is not too far away from like the truth 100 years from now. Guys, I mean, we've actually somehow managed to roll on to kind of 80 minutes of chatting already, which has absolutely flown by. Brin, I was interested. We'll start kind of heading for the door, but we'll see. I'll have a look at some questions here. But having left the police, how much of your expertise is retained now within the police? You know, do you go back and is your knowledge retained or still available to the police? We often talk about with Gerard that, you know, Gerard's been, you know, leaves that there's no interest in bringing his knowledge, keep retaining his knowledge there.
Yeah, my experience has probably mirrored Gerard's.
Okay.
Where it's kind of like, you know, policing in the UK was called, you know, people would often refer to it as the job. You know, you could almost see the capital T, capital J. And once you were out of the job, you know, you sort of cease to exist somewhat. So, no, I don't think a lot of it was retained.
Okay.
I think, funny enough, I am seeing, though, more communities of people who are wanting to share information.
Yeah. And
certainly I've been interested in going back to speak to people I used to work with to see, actually, how can I help you develop your career? Because actually, and I'll be cheeky and pick up something in the chat that Candice Van Dam asked, was, has it made, being around these people made me question my own inner self or identify similarities? And yeah, totally. And I think that's been the biggest learning reflection for me, looking back, because, you know, as I say in the book, you know, one, I think it was in May, walked into our family kitchen, sunny day, and I thought, I'm going to kill myself. You know, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I knew where I was going to do it. And I just felt such relief. I was like, wow, I don't have to be in pain anymore. This is going to be great. And luckily for me, that was immediately followed by anger. because I was like, you know what, I've seen what this looks like. It's going to be ugly. It's probably going to be my family who found it. And why, how have I got to this place? Somebody with all the privileges of my life, that I've reached that. And, I Googled the first counsel I could find, spoke to someone. And the thing that I realized by doing that was I'd been telling myself a story in my head, almost unconsciously, about who I was and my usefulness in the world.
Yeah.
And that story was a fiction, but it had slowly corroded, my sense of self-worth. And it did make me think back to those stories that prisoners told themselves and said, actually, I'd fallen victim to my own version of a killer story.
Yeah.
And that's kind of part of what motivated me to write the book, because I thought, you know what, if somebody like me, with loving parents from a loving background and a good education and really all the privilege anyone could ask for, if I could get myself into that hole because of the story I was telling myself, then you know what, other people could too. So, here's to sharing something that could maybe help people.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Brin. We appreciate it. What is your story now? And what is your story for the next decade?
Oh, now you're asking. I haven't planned that far.
What's the plan?
Well, you know what I'm finding really motivational is being able to share the power of stories with people and give people practical techniques from psychology that they could use to help make their lives a little bit better. So I've been doing training courses mostly with colleagues in healthcare, and I've probably given the training course to a few hundred people now. And, it's really building on the idea of what we've learned in Killer Stories and building on that. And there might even be thoughts of another book in the pipeline, because I'm fascinated. And, Gerard can probably already see the email being drafted in my mind. I'm fascinated by how the stories we tell as a society or as a group of people can be so powerful. Because in Killer Stories, I just focused on our individual story. But I think there's a lot of stories you tell, in a cult, in a team, in a relationship, that can be harmful. And how do we, as hopefully decent human beings, protect ourselves from that? But for now, it's very much what can we use to kill the killer stories that we might have inside of ourselves? That's my motivation for now.
Okay. Gerard, do you have any last questions for Brin? Is there anything you'd like to ask Brin that you've not asked in the course of our discussion? That
a practical one. Your book. You're obviously based in the UK, but the book is available here.
Yes,
can people also get it in the UK? Was it I know Penguin or wherever is regional?
Yeah, so it's exact. So the publisher's Jonathan Ball. They offer a print-on-demand service in the UK. So if you go onto Amazon.uk, similarly, if you go onto Amazon in the States, you will be able to get the book. It'll probably arrive within 3 to 5 working days, because this is one of those copies. But if you're in Joburg, I think, exclusive books should have copies. I know the stock levels look like they're getting low, so rush out quickly. But you should be able to get it online.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Great. And also, we wanted to just point people at your website as well. So run along to killerstories.com. There it is. And you can find out more information there. Am I correct? Anything to add?
That is it. And that would particularly be about sort of training courses in storytelling. If there's something you're interested in, drop me a line, and I'd love to see how I could help if I can.
Okay, fab. Brin, it's been wonderful having the opportunity to spend the last hour and a half with you. We'd love you to, as we say to everyone, we're all about community and kind of embracing this new media landscape that we find ourselves in. And as the podcast has been evolving over the last few months, we've really been starting to connect to people around the world. And it's just really great to get your perspective on, your career there in the UK and some of the realities in the UK. And I always feel at this stage like we've only scratched the surface of a conversation, which is good because it means we've got good reason to come back to continue the chat and maybe do a deep dive on a particular case or two as well. So please do join us again and consider yourself a friend of the profilers.
Oh,
Great
Or
to
a friend of
catch
the
up.
profilers. Yeah.
and it's been so wonderful to catch up with both of you. It's been far too long since our last conversation, so it's been a delight. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I won't ask you to wrap up with the 5-minute stand-up set. When we were back at university, there was a friend of ours by the name of Bevan Callanan, who folks would know in South Africa as perhaps the Tooth Fairy or Norm from the Toasty Show back in the day. And he started a stand-up comedy night. And I tried a set out one time, Gerard. And after the show, Bevan came to me and said, "Listen, Paul, you're not funny at all, but would you like to be the MC?" And I think he felt like my intense lack of funniness would illuminate the comedian's actual funniness. And so I ended up kind of hosting those nights for a while, and Brin was one of the guys that would come along. And very funny though. Brin was was really one of our star comics back at university days, eh?
Multi-talented.
Multi-talented.
And then it all went wrong, and I went for serial murder and psychology instead of comedy.
Look, maybe in the next decade, there's a way to find the middle ground there. You know what I mean? Maybe
Killer jokes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brin. Thank you, Gerard, as always. Where are you back in Joburg this time next week, Gerard?
Yeah, so definitely by Friday at the latest, because my trial is not my trial, but the trial I'm assisting with is set down until Friday. But we've asked the magistrate, not we, but the lawyers have asked the magistrate to withdraw from the case, and we're going to get the finding tomorrow whether she will. If she doesn't withdraw, then the case continues with evidence until at least Friday. So, it's a bit unpredictable, as these things always are.
Okay. Next week, we're going to be talking about an interesting topic. We're going to be interrogating some of the realities around crime statistics in South Africa, in particular in the context of, are we seeing a genocide happening? And, Brin, what are your thoughts on the refugee status of South Africans at the moment? Any thoughts there? It's a touchy one to go. But
I won't touch it directly, but I will say one of my jobs during COVID in the UK was dealing with evacuees from Kabul after it had just fallen. And when people are arriving at the other side of the world with gunshots, shrapnel injury, they don't know where their family is. That to me felt, like the full refugee experience.
yeah.
I can't say what the circumstances for these other refugees are, but it certainly seems a stark comparison based on the little I know.
Yeah, very topical in South Africa, and we're going to look at it from kind of a cold, hard facts perspective, and really from a perspective of who are the actual victims, who are the real victims of crime at the moment in South Africa, and how can we start to think about addressing some of the very severe issues that we have from that perspective in South Africa. Thank you, Brin. Gerard, I'm going to say goodbye to the both of you, and I'm just going to say a couple of extra things to everybody who's still watching. Thank you guys for tuning in once again to Profiler. Of course, do hit the like, hit subscribe. It really does help the growth of the channel. We are going to be dropping the next episode of South African Serial. I did want to say thank you so much for all your support there and for so many people watching. We've over 100,000 views on the first episode, and we're up to 60,000 views on the second, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. We'll be dropping the new episode of that at 8 a.m. on Thursday. That's Thursday, the 22nd of May. We're going to be making this one available to everyone immediately, so you'll be able to stream it as soon as it goes live. So please do check that out. We've got 12 episodes to play out, and those will be playing out over the next 12 weeks. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Chris de Kock, the former head of crime research at SAPS, to ask some blunt questions. Like I said, who's really at risk of violent crime in South Africa? Are white farmers being targeted, or is something else going on? And why does the white genocide narrative keep popping up? And what are some of the realities around that? So I think that'll be an interesting conversation. Thank you to Shelley for your, oops, I don't know why that popped up there, for your super sticker. We really appreciate all contributions to the channel. I'm going to leave you guys with a little clip from this week's episode of South African Serial and invite you to join us again for the live next week at 8 o'clock. Appreciate you. And don't forget, trust no one.
Children are capable of committing the most horrendous crimes.
There was a little baby of 4 months old, a little baby girl.
An axe is very lethal.
There must be some sort of satanic link.
He became involved in Satanism.
That his grandmother hits him with a stick.
It is a pity that this case received very little media attention.
This little boy killed all of his family members.
The community was so upset that they would have killed the accused. I was shocked that a child could commit such a heinous crime.
I am a human being and I kill human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.